Mercy General's ER in Raleigh smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee at 11 p.m. when Megan O'Brien clocks in for the overnight shift. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry insects, casting everything in that sickly yellow that makes skin look cadaverous. She keeps her eyes down as she passes the nurse's station, her badge already clipped to her scrubs, blue background, white lettering, nothing that hints at what came before. The trauma bay doors are propped open. A stretcher sits empty. Waiting. She's been here 3 months now. 91 days since she walked away from the Coast Guard, since she left behind a career that stretched across 18 years and 3 continents, since she chose anonymity over recognition in a city where nobody knew her name or what her name used to mean. Raleigh was random. Nobody asked questions here. Nobody looked up from their phones long enough to notice the tattoo on her left forearm was partly covered by a watch she'd bought specifically for that purpose. The break room smells like spilled creamer and desperation. She pours a cup of coffee that tastes like it's been heating since the morning shift and sits in the corner, pulling a protein bar from her jacket pocket. The other night nurses barely acknowledge her. That's fine. Better that way. She eats quickly, the bar tasting like cardboard and almonds, and allows herself exactly 47 seconds to touch the faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, the only piece of Sanjin she allowed herself to carry. Fingers tracing the stitching. A ritual that grounds her. A reminder that she was someone else, once. Her left hand is trembling slightly as she touches it. She presses her palm flat against the jacket to steady it. Pain is information. The trembling isn't fear, it's restraint. 3 years of therapy had taught her that. 3 years of sitting in VA hospital waiting rooms, watching other veterans whose wounds matched her own, learning that waking up swinging at shadows at 2 in the morning was a symptom, not a personality flaw. Learning that some nights she could breathe through the memories. Most nights she couldn't. But she showed up anyway. At 11:45, she begins prepping room 347. The bed gets fresh linens, pulled tight with military precision. Equipment check, cardiac monitor, pulse oximetry, blood pressure cuff, oxygen setup with non-rebreather hanging nearby. She moves with absolute certainty, positioning everything exactly where instinct tells her it should be, her hands moving on their own like they're operating independent of her brain. Muscle memory from a lifetime of field medicine before this. Before the ER. Before Raleigh. The room is cold, kept that way for reasons that have nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with infection control. A Coast Guard commander is coming in. The intake sheet says construction accident, fractured femur, collapsed left lung, sedated but stable post-reduction. Admitted through emergency transport from the site outside Durham. No family listed. No emergency contact. Just a name and a rank and a series of injuries that told their own story about what happens when steel beams don't behave the way engineers promised. She doesn't know yet. She has no way of knowing what's about to walk through that door. Dr. Sterling arrives at midnight, stepping into the ER like a man who owns the building. 15 years at Mercy General had taught him that the institution belonged to him more than it did to anyone else, certainly more than it belonged to the administrators who signed his paychecks or the board members who rubber-stamped his decisions. He moves through the nurse's station with the ease of a man accustomed to deference, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, his stethoscope draped around his neck like an iron collar. He's handsome in that calculated way some men are, a jawline that photographs well, salt and pepper hair he gets trimmed every 3 weeks at a place that costs more than most people's car payments. He notices Megan immediately, though not because of her skill. She's finishing before setup in 3:47, checking the saline drip, her movements economical and precise. What catches his attention is what she doesn't do. She doesn't introduce herself when she passes in the hallway. She doesn't make eye contact. She doesn't correct the tech who calls her Meg instead of Megan. She just adjusts the flow rate, checks the bandage, and moves on to the next task with the quiet efficiency of someone who's learned that visibility equals target. Sterling watches from the doorway for exactly 17 seconds. Long enough to catalogue her. Young enough to be moldable. Quiet enough not to challenge him. Perfect. The commander arrives at 12:42 a.m., brought in on a gurney by paramedics whose radio traffic had warned about the crush injuries and the complication, the lung. His left leg is splintered from hip to ankle, the fracture already set in the field. His breathing is shallow, assisted by a ventilator that hisses its mechanical rhythm in perfect time with the monitor beeping. Sedated enough that his eyes stay closed, his face slack. His mid-50s maybe, built like someone who's spent decades in the gym and in the field, the kind of man whose hands look scarred even unconscious. Megan doesn't react when she sees him. She simply moves into her role, checking lines, confirming vitals, making notations on the chart with the kind of clinical detachment that comes from years of never letting the patient become a person. Vital signs are stable. O2 sat 94 on the vent. Heart rate holding steady at 81. BP 120/78. Everything by the book. Sterling approaches the bed after she steps back. He runs his own hand along the chart, eye scanning, nodding to himself like he's seeing something she missed. He doesn't speak to her. Doesn't ask her any questions. Just absorbs the room and makes some mental note that he alone seems to understand. It's in the break room at 1:15 a.m. that everything shifts. Sterling walks in where 3 other nurses are sitting, 2 RNs from the day shift finishing paperwork, 1 respiratory tech scrolling through his phone. They all look up, the automatic deference of employees recognizing their superior. He grabs the coffee pot, pours a cup, and casually mentions that he's noticed the new hire, Megan, starting her rotation. Seems competent enough, he says, the words landing lightly. Though I'm betting $500 she won't make it past the week. The respiratory tech laughs. One of the day shift nurses raises an eyebrow. The other one shifts in her seat, uncomfortable with the kind of cruelty that's dressed up as casual observation. 500, the tech says. That confident? Sterling shrugs, sitting down like he's settling in for a long conversation. She's got that look about her. The ones who can't handle the overnight grind always do. Too soft. Too careful. You can see it in how they move, like they're always apologizing for taking up space. 3 days, maybe 4, and she'll realize this isn't for her. The words aren't loud. They're not meant to be heard. But the way they float across the break room carries the weight of authority. Sterling's been here long enough that his opinions calcify into fact. If he thinks she'll quit, then people start watching for signs that she will. If he thinks she's soft, then every mistake becomes confirmation, every success becomes luck. What he doesn't see is that Megan has already died once. What he doesn't know is that walking away from the Coast Guard wasn't about the nightmares, it was about the weight of the lives she couldn't save. That her hands trembled not because she was weak, but because they'd held 3 men together in a ditch while shrapnel screamed overhead and she spent 6 hours deciding whether to save them or let them go, and finally managed to do both. He doesn't know any of this. Nobody does. She finishes her shift at 7 a.m., sunlight streaming through the ER windows now, turning everything sharp and real and exposed. She clocks out without speaking to anyone, passes Sterling in the hallway, he's still here, working a double, and feels the weight of his dismissal like a physical thing. She's already quit in his mind. She just doesn't know it yet. In her car, sitting in the parking lot of Mercy General, she allows herself to cry once. Just once. Just for 3 minutes. Then she wipes her face, touches the unit patch through her jacket one more time, and drives home to the apartment that still doesn't feel real. The one where nothing is unpacked except the necessities, where the walls stay bare because staying temporary feels safer than staying. She doesn't know about the commander in room 347 yet. She doesn't know his name or his rank or what his tattoo means. She doesn't know that in exactly 4 days, at 2 in the morning, everything she's buried is going to surface. She doesn't know that the quiet nurse everyone underestimates is about to remind someone why legends are called that. For now, she just drives, and the city of Raleigh unfolds around her like a secret no one's asked her to keep. The morning rounds at Mercy General moved like clockwork, and Megan O'Brien moved like she was trying to disappear into the fluorescent light. Sterling walked the corridor with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras attached to a shark, and when he reached Bay 6, he didn't even glance at the septic patient whose fever had spiked 3 times in 6 hours. Megan stood at the foot of the bed, chart in her hands, and her voice came out soft, measured, careful. "Doctor, I think Bay 6 needs another 24 hours before discharge. The infection markers are still climbing." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Sterling stopped mid-stride. The residents froze. He turned to face her, and his smile was the kind that makes predators tilt their heads at prey they've already decided to kill. "Nurse O'Brien," he said, loud enough that the station nurse 3 beds away looked up. "Your 3 months here trumps my 15 years. He turned to the residents, eyebrow raised like this was the punchline of a joke they were all in on together. "Should we take bets on how long she lasts?" "I give her a week." The residents laughed, nervous, uncertain laughs that still sounded like laughter. Megan took one measured breath. She nodded once, just once, and walked away without a word. Her hands weren't shaking. Her jaw wasn't clenched. She simply moved, her scrub swishing against her legs with a sound like wind through dry grass, and she disappeared into the supply room where no one could see her face. The next morning, the cafeteria smelled like industrial coffee and something burning under a heat lamp. Megan sat alone at a corner table, her tray in front of her, salad, yogurt, water, and she was focused on the chart she was reading because reading charts was safer than making eye contact. Sterling walked past her table carrying his own tray, and their eyes met for exactly 1 second. That's all it took. He shifted his weight, and his lunch tray went over the edge of the table, coffee splashing across her chest and scrubs like a small, deliberate wave, salad scattering across the floor in a pattern that looked almost artistic. "Oops," he said, his voice carrying across the entire cafeteria. "Better clean that up, sweetheart." The room went dead silent. Forks stopped mid-motion. Conversations died mid-sentence. Megan knelt on the floor without hesitation. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had cleaned up worse things than lettuce and dressing in places where the sound of her breathing could get her killed. She picked up each piece methodically, stacking it on a napkin, and Sterling stood above her with his hands on his hips. He dropped her patient charts on the floor beside her, the papers fanning out like cards dealt for a game she didn't agree to play. "Pick those up too. Might as well make yourself useful." His voice had the texture of something sharp being dragged across wood. Megan continued working, her movement steady as stone, and when she stood up with the scattered charts pressed against her wet scrubs, she wiped a single tear from her cheek. She didn't hide it. She didn't rush. She simply touched her face with one finger, felt the moisture, and let her eyes lock onto his without blinking, without looking away, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing fear. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, doctor," she said. Her voice had changed something in it, still quiet, but not soft anymore. The quiet of a door closing. Sterling leaned in close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore like armor. "That's because you are the mess, sweetheart. This hospital has standards." He straightened up, adjusted his jacket, and walked away. The cafeteria remained silent for exactly 7 seconds, then conversations resumed, but everyone was listening to the wrong conversation now. 2 nurses at a corner table whispered something about Sterling's reputation for chewing up new staff. A resident checked his phone. The lunch crowd pretended to eat, but most of them were watching Megan walk to the bathroom with soggy charts against her chest, coffee dripping from her elbows, and no one moved to help her. No one offered napkins or kind words. The message had been sent clearly: Sterling owned this hospital, and anyone who stood against him would learn what silence looked like from the inside. That night, during shift change, Sterling found the overnight charge nurse at the station. His voice was casual, the tone of someone sharing concern. "Watch Megan O'Brien closely. She's emotionally unstable. Not to be trusted with critical decisions. I've seen it before with new staff: they overreach, they panic, they make mistakes under pressure." The charge nurse nodded, wrote a note, and by the time Megan arrived for her shift, the information had circulated through the overnight staff like something alive, something growing. Sterling had transformed bullying into institutional concern, humiliation into competent oversight, and by 1:56 a.m. when Megan checked on the commander in room 347, everyone at Mercy General already believed she was the liability. The commander was stable when she approached his bed, which meant his oxygen was fine, his heart rate was regular, his blood pressure was holding. The surgical repair of his fractured femur and collapsed lung from the construction accident had taken 6 hours, and he'd been recovering for 18 of them, sedated deep, a vent tube going in through his mouth, monitors beeping their steady rhythm like something alive and domesticated. 40-something, dark hair going grey at the temples, he looked smaller asleep than most people did awake. When Megan adjusted his blanket, she saw it, the edge of a tattoo on his left arm, just visible where the hospital gown had slipped. Letters. A name. Her name, she realized, the letters forming something she hadn't let herself think about in 3 years. M. the Brian, Sanjin. Her hand moved to her jacket pocket where the faded unit patch sat sewn into the lining, and her fingers pressed against it like it was a heartbeat she was trying to feel through fabric. At 2:03 a.m., the pulse ox alarm screamed, a sound like something dying, high-pitched and insistent. Megan's eye snapped up from her chart. The oxygen saturation was dropping, 91, 88, 84. She ran, her boots hitting the tile floor in a rhythm that echoed, and when she reached his bed she saw it immediately. His lips were blue, the trachea deviated right like a compass needle spinning wrong, the jugular veins bulging in his neck, absent breath sounds on the left side. Tension pneumothorax. The surgical repair had failed, and his lung was collapsing again, filling his chest with air that had nowhere to go. She hit the code button and called for Sterling. The operator paged him twice, her voice crisp and urgent, and Megan stood at the bedside with her left hand trembling, just her left, just that one, while her right hand stayed absolutely steady. 3 minutes passed like hours compressed. The commander's lips deepened to purple. His heart rate climbed, 120, 130, 140. Sterling's voice crackled over the intercom, mechanical and distant. Nurse O'Brien is not authorized to call codes without my assessment first. I'm reviewing another case. Wait. She hung up. Call Dr. Park, the overnight physician, and when he answered she said, Commander Walsh in 347, tension pneumothorax, O2 sat 79, and there was a pause, just a pause, and then he said, Sterling told us you panic unnecessarily, and hung up. The phone went dead in her hand. The commander's oxygen dropped to 79. Megan stood at the bedside in the silence that comes before everything changes, and she reached for the needle decompression kit. The needle was 14 gauge, 2 inches of metal that was going to go between his ribs at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and the hiss of air escaping was going to mean he lived instead of died. She had done this 3 times in one night in Sanjin, 3 men, 3 needles, 3 moments that felt like the entire war happening in sequence. Her hands remembered. Her body remembered. The fear tried to rise up in her throat, but it was old fear now, familiar as an old scar, and she pushed it down because pushing down fear was what senior chief petty officers did. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that no one was coming. No doctor. No team. Just a nurse they'd all decided to dismiss, alone with a dying man and a needle, about to make a choice that would either prove her worth or destroy everything they'd already decided she was. The clock above room 347 read 1:56 a.m. when Megan checked on the commander for the 4th time that shift. His vitals were steady, blood pressure 118/72, heart rate 64, oxygen saturation 96% on 2 liters. The sedative drip moved steadily through the fall line, and his chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of someone whose body was finally allowing itself to heal. She adjusted his blanket without waking him, her fingers brushing the edge of the bandaging across his ribs where the construction accident had fractured 3 of them. Everything looked normal. Everything felt safe. She had no idea it wouldn't last. At 2:53 a.m., the monitors started singing a different song. The oxygen saturation dropped first, 96, 94, 92, numbers falling like dominoes. Then his breathing changed. Not labored yet, but changing, becoming shallow, rapid. Megan was at his bedside before the alarm finished its first wail, her eyes already reading the clinical story the machines were telling her. His neck veins were distending. His trachea was shifting. His color was graying at the edges. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing his left lung, pressurizing his chest cavity, compressing his heart. The accident hadn't caused it, the chest tube hadn't been placed, the simple act of breathing had created a one-way valve inside his chest, air going in with every breath, nowhere for it to escape. A slow suffocation from the inside. "I need a doctor in 347 now," Megan called into the unit phone, her voice level, controlled, the voice of someone reporting routine information rather than a man dying with every breath. The night supervisor answered. She explained the vital signs, the assessment findings, the clinical picture. Seconds of silence. Then the supervisor's voice came back tight and careful. "Dr. Sterling said you were unstable. That we shouldn't take your clinical assessment seriously. I'm calling for backup, but you need to step back from that patient." The phone disconnected. Megan stood in the dim room, the monitors screaming their alarms, the commander's oxygen saturation now at 84 and falling. She moved into the hallway, searching. Dr. Brennan in the medical ICU was on his phone, eyes averted when she approached. The ER attending wouldn't take her call. The resident she found near the supply closet looked at her name badge and said, "Yeah, I heard about you." Not happening. She tried the night hospitalist. His voice through the phone was apologetic but firm. "I can't authorize you for anything critical." Sterling made that pretty clear. No team. No backup. No authorization. No time. At 2:07 a.m., Commander Walsh's oxygen saturation was 71%. His lips were turning blue. His body was beginning to fight, muscles tensing beneath the sedative, instinct overriding pharmacology. Megan returned to his room, closed the door, and made a choice that would either save his life or end her career, possibly both. She gathered what she needed with the precise movements of someone who had done this before, in a place far from here, in a world that felt like a different lifetime. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Alcohol prep pad. Gloves. She moved like something was guiding her hands, some muscle memory that had been sleeping for 3 years, waiting for a moment exactly like this. The second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomy was the same now as it had been in that ditch outside San Jin when a Marine sergeant's lung had collapsed from shrapnel and she'd had nothing but an 4 needle and a prayer and the absolute certainty that if she didn't act, he'd die. Her hand started to shake as she prepped his skin. The tremor was fear, was years of trying to be small enough to disappear, was the weight of knowing what she'd lose if this went wrong. Then the needle touched his skin and the shaking stopped. Muscle memory took over completely. Her hands became instruments, steady and precise. She found the space between his ribs, felt the subtle give as the needle penetrated the chest wall, and pushed through. The hiss came, sharp and clear, the sound of pressure releasing, trapped air escaping at 40 miles per hour. The commander's body convulsed once, then settled. Megan threaded the catheter over the needle with movements that looked almost lazy, so controlled they seemed slow. She removed the needle, secured the catheter with tape, and stepped back. The monitors immediately began their recovery song. Oxygen saturation climbed, 82, 84, 86, 88, 89. His color returned in real time, the gray receding from his lips, his trachea shifting back to midline where it belonged. His breathing deepened, became rhythmic again. Sinus rhythm. Normal sinus rhythm. The kind of rhythm that meant life instead of death. Megan's hands began to tremble again, now that the work was done, now that her body understood it could release the pressure. She bagged him manually while reaching for the phone to call for a chest tube setup, her voice coming out mechanical and flat, the same voice she'd used in Sanjin when she'd told the men around her that everything would be fine even as blood soaked through her uniform and rounds cracked the air above their heads. Clinical. Detached. The voice of someone compartmentalizing horror. By 2:53 a.m., the chest tube was placed by a surgeon who arrived and asked no questions, who simply read the chart, looked at the commander's stable vitals, and nodded at Megan once before proceeding. She cleaned the equipment, disposed of the needle, and began charting the procedure, time of intervention, vital sign changes, the airway assessment, the decision tree that had led her to act. Her hands moved across the keyboard, but the tremor was back now, violent and uncontrollable, the physical manifestation of what her face and voice refused to show. Dr. Sterling walked into room 347 at 3:05 a.m. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. The commander breathing steadily at 98% oxygen saturation. The new chest tube in place, already draining. The monitors displaying the green rhythm of recovery. Megan still standing at the computer, charting with hands that shook like someone in the final stages of hypothermia. He read her chart entry. Reread it. His jaw tightened. He said nothing to her, but picked up the room phone and dialed with deliberate slowness, each number a small act of aggression. When someone answered, his voice was different, crisp, authoritative, the voice of a man exercising institutional power. We have a critical incident. Nurse O'Brien performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. Needle decompression. On a sedated patient. I need this escalated immediately to administration. He listened for a moment, then, yes, I'm aware she may have saved his life. That doesn't change the protocol violation. I'll document everything. He hung up. Looked at Megan once, the look you give a problem you've already decided how to solve. Continue monitoring, he said flatly. Don't touch anything else. 18 minutes later, he returned with the night supervisor and 2 hospital security officers whose uniforms suddenly made the room feel like an interrogation. The supervisor's face was carefully neutral, which meant she'd already made her decision before she arrived. Sterling had that effect on people. His authority was like gravity, pulling everyone into his orbit whether they wanted to go or not. Ms. O'Brien, we're going to need you to step away from the patient, the supervisor said quietly. There's been a concern raised about your clinical judgment tonight. We need you to come with security while we investigate. Megan didn't look up from the monitor. His oxygen saturation is 98. His trachea is midline. He's breathing on his own with a patent airway. The chest tube is patent and draining appropriately. She said it like she was reading a weather report, like her career wasn't being dismantled in real time by a man who'd decided she was disposable 3 weeks ago. I understand. Come with us, please. She saved the chart. Removed her gloves. Followed them out of the room, past the nurse's station where Sterling was already speaking to the skeleton crew, his voice carrying the weight of institutional certainty. When you can't follow protocol, people die. She's lucky this patient survived her cowboy medicine. This is exactly what I was concerned about. Megan walked past without stopping. The security officers flanked her like guards escorting a prisoner. Her badge was deactivated at the main entrance. The parking lot was dark and wet from rain that had fallen while she was inside, and she stood in the moisture for a long moment, letting the cold soak into her scrubs, not quite ready to move toward her car. Behind her, through the glass doors of Mercy General, the commander in room 347 slept peacefully, oxygen at 98%, his body finally healing, completely unaware that the nurse who'd saved his life was being escorted from the hospital by security at 4:44 a.m. for doing exactly that. By 6 in the morning, Dr. Sterling was on his private cell in the hospital corridor, his voice steady and precise as he spoke to the board president at home. We have a critical liability issue. An unstable nurse performed an unauthorized procedure last night, tension pneumothorax decompression without physician oversight, without consent protocols, without any attending present. He paused, letting the silence work. I documented it. She violated every guideline in the emergency response manual. We're exposed if she does this again and the patient codes. The board president, still in bed, asked what procedure was actually performed. Sterling's answer was technically accurate but contextually lethal, a needle insertion into the pleural space. Extremely high risk. I'm not questioning her intent, but intent doesn't matter when we're facing a malpractice suit. By 8 o'clock, Sterling had already called 3 of Megan's employment references from her resume. The first number was disconnected, a clinic in Portland that closed in 2019. The second went to a medical staffing agency that had no record of anyone named Megan O'Brien in their system. The third was answered by a confused administrator who said the facility had never employed anyone with that name. Sterling made notes, his handwriting sharp and deliberate. Gaps in the work history. Years unaccounted for. A background that didn't hold water when you actually pulled the thread. By noon, he had arranged for an outside investigator from the state medical board to come review Megan's charts. Not a routine check. A formal audit. Sterling met with him in a conference room, spreading 3 months of documentation across the table like evidence in a trial. Look at this case here, 68-year-old male, sepsis protocol. She flagged a discharge decision I made. Questioned my judgment in front of residents. That's insubordination. And here, medication administration on a pediatric patient, timing slightly off the standard interval. Nothing egregious, but it shows inconsistent protocol adherence. The investigator, a grey-haired man with the exhausted expression of someone who had seen this kind of thing before, made notes. Sterling leaned back in his chair, relaxed, confident. I'm not trying to destroy her career. I'm trying to protect this hospital. We don't know who she is. We don't know where she came from. And now we know she'll make independent medical decisions without authorization. The investigator left with copies of everything. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, certified mail was delivered to the apartment Megan rented under her maiden name, a one-bedroom in a quiet complex where nobody knew her, where her sister had never been invited, where she had built an anonymous life from nothing. The envelope was thick and official, the letterhead unmistakable, Mercy General Human Resources Department. Megan sat on the floor of her kitchen with the papers spread around her, reading the termination notice twice, then a third time. Suspension pending investigation. Violation of emergency protocols. Failure to follow chain of command procedures. Recommendation for credential review by the state licensing board. Effective immediately. She set the papers down and picked up her phone. The VA hospital number was still in her contacts, saved 2 years ago during a moment of weakness she had never acted on. She stared at the digits for a long time before dialing. 3 days later, Megan sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital psychiatric intake clinic, surrounded by veterans whose wounds she recognized because she had seen them before, in mirrors, in her own reflection every morning. A Vietnam-era ball cap on an older man whose hands trembled slightly as he filled out his intake form. A woman with a prosthetic leg, the titanium gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A young guy in his mid-20s rocking slowly back and forth in his chair, eyes fixed on nothing, the kind of 1,000-yard stare that came from places this waiting room was designed to understand. Megan had taken a number from the dispenser by the door. 47. The digital display showed 43. She held the intake form in her lap, a clipboard and pen, a series of questions that were supposed to unlock the parts of her mind that she had spent years locking down. The first line asked for her name. She wrote it in careful block letters, MEGANOBRIEN. Below that, her date of birth, her social security number, the beginning of a paper trail that would connect this new version of herself back to the version she had tried to leave behind in Sanjin. The next section asked about service history. Years of service. Rank. Theater of operations. Specific traumatic events. Her vision blurred. She set down the pen. The intake form trembled in her hands, not from fear but from something deeper, something that felt like surrender. Around her, the waiting room hummed with the small sounds of other people's damage, the rustle of magazines nobody was reading, the faint buzz of the fluorescent panels overhead, the occasional soft cough. A TV mounted in the corner played a news broadcast with the volume muted. The clock on the wall read 2:43 p.m. She had survived IED shrapnel. She had survived 2 miles through gunfire dragging an unconscious commander. She had survived 3 years of nightmares and hypervigilance and waking up swinging at shadows. She had survived a blatant attempt to destroy her by a man she had never threatened, a man whose only real power was the ability to make people believe his version of the truth. But this, sitting in a waiting room with the intake form in her hands, writing her own name as if she were admitting something she had always known, this felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. The digital display changed. 44. 45. Megan closed her eyes and heard the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance, real or imagined, coming closer. She heard rain on the waiting room's exterior windows. She heard the steady pulse of her own heartbeat, proof that she was still alive, still here, still carrying the weight of 6 hours in a ditch with a man whose name was tattooed on her ribs in coordinates and call signs. She picked up the pen again, gripping it with the steady hands of someone who had learned not to tremble under pressure. The intake form waited. Her name waited. The veteran across from her looked up briefly, made eye contact for less than a second, and nodded, a small acknowledgement of shared territory, of knowing what it meant to sit in a place like this. The next question on the form asked, "Have you experienced events that you find difficult to discuss?" Megan's hand moved across the paper. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that would define what came next. That moment was still 4 days away, waiting in an administrative conference room where a 17-year-old boy with her eyes would walk through a door carrying a shadow box of medals, and the entire architecture of lies that Dr. Sterling had built would collapse like a structure made of paper and bad intentions. The hospital board conference room smelled like burnt coffee and the sharp tang of ozone, fluorescent lights humming overhead like a swarm of angry wasps. Patricia Chen, the board president, sat at the head of the polished walnut table, her fingers steepled, waiting for Sterling to explain himself. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The doors burst open. A 17-year-old boy stood in the threshold, his shoulders shaking, his hands trembling around a shadow box of medals. His face was Megan's face, the same sharp cheekbones, the same determined jaw, but softer, unfinished, still learning what strength meant. "These are my moms," he said, his voice cracking like glass underwater. "You need to see these before he lies anymore." Sterling stood. "Young man, this is a private meeting." The boy stepped forward. His voice steadied, deepened, moved like a weapon finding its target. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, United States Coast Guard." He opened the shadow box. Medals caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like accusations. Navy Cross. Purple Heart. Combat Action Ribbon. She didn't quit this hospital because she was unstable. She was fired for saving a man's life. The room didn't move. Not one person breathed. Patricia Chen's hand moved toward the shadow box, slow, reverent, the way someone approaches a holy relic. Her fingers trembled, not weakness, but the recognition of something momentous crossing a threshold. The boy read from a printed page, his voice steady now, a young man reporting facts. "My mom carried Commander James Walsh out of an ambush. Carried him 2 miles through gunfire after an IED shredded their convoy. She stayed with 3 men in a ditch in Sanjin while their position was shelled for 6 hours straight." He looked directly at Sterling. "She didn't break under fire. She's not going to break under you." The door opened again. Commander Walsh stood in the frame on crutches, his dress blues creased knife-sharp, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, idle but capable of destroying everything in front of it. He moved into the room with the terrifying fluid precision of a man who had survived things that kill other people. He pulled up his sleeve. Megan's name was tattooed on his left forearm in script that looked like it had been done with field equipment and shaking hands. M. O'Brien, Sanjin. Below it, 3 names followed, and below those, coordinates. "I have no idea who saved me in that ER, he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone used to giving orders to people who listened or died. "I was sedated. I didn't see her face until I saw that tape." He gestured to the monitor, where Marcus Webb, the hospital IT director, a Navy veteran himself, was queuing up security footage. "But I know exactly who brought me home from Afghanistan." Webb hit play. The cafeteria footage stuttered to life on the conference room screen. Megan kneeling, cleaning spilled coffee. Sterling approaching from the left side, his posture casual, predatory. His mouth moving, "Pick that up, sweetheart." The way he dropped the charts. The way they scattered across the tile like snow. The way he laughed, that particular sound of a man who believed his authority was absolute. Webb let it run for 8 seconds, then froze the frame on Megan's face. One tear. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes meeting Sterling's with a gaze that held no submission, only patience. Patricia Chen stared at the frozen image. Her fingers moved to her throat. "There's more," Webb said quietly. He cued another file. Audio only this time. Timestamp, 2:51 a.m., 3 days ago. Sterling's voice, clipped, certain. "Dr. Park, do not respond to O'Brien's calls. She's unstable. I'm handling this." Behind the audio, a different screen showed vital signs. Commander Walsh's oxygen saturation, 68%. Dropping. 65, 61. Then Megan appeared on the monitor, moving toward the bedside with the economical grace of someone who had trained her body to obey in combat. The needle went in. The hiss of air. Saturation climbing, 75, 82, 88, 92, stable. Sterling arriving 8 minutes later. Not to check the patient. To make a phone call. 18 minutes, Webb said. His voice sounded like gravel being ground under boots. That's how long Dr. Sterling waited before responding to the code. 18 minutes while his staff stayed away because he told them the nurse couldn't be trusted. Patricia Chen's eyes were fixed on the shadow box. On Megan's medals. On the Navy Cross, the third highest award for valor in combat. Sterling opened his mouth. Patricia Chen raised a hand. One gesture, and the room understood, "Say nothing." "Doctor," she said, and her voice had transformed into something sharp enough to cut. "You prioritized destroying this woman's career over a patient in respiratory distress. A patient you knew was under her care. A patient who would have died in that 18-minute gap if Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien hadn't acted without authorization." Sterling tried again. Names started coming out: board president's first name, golf tournament, campaign contributions, a network of favors built over 15 years. His voice climbed higher with each reference, desperation moving like an animal looking for an exit that didn't exist. Commander Walsh moved to the conference room door and held it open. Not an invitation. A command. Hospital security appeared in the hallway. Their presence was quiet, professional, and absolute. Sterling gathered his briefcase with shaking hands. His wallet. His keys. His access badge was already being deactivated in real time, Webb working the hospital system from his laptop, erasing Sterling's credentials with keystrokes that sounded like period marks at the end of sentences. Within the hour, Sterling was walking out of Mercy General for the last time, escorted by security, a cardboard box of personal effects held against his chest like armor that no longer fit. His locker had been emptied by HR. His reserved parking spot was already being painted over with new initials. The State Medical Board would launch a formal investigation within 72 hours. His wife would file for separation after the local news picked up the story. Decorated veteran fired after saving patient's life, a headline that would run on every news site in North Carolina. 3 hospitals in Atlanta and Charlotte where he had interviewed would suddenly become unreachable. A lawyer would negotiate his license down to a 10-year suspension instead of permanent revocation. He would end up teaching CPR certification classes at Raleigh Community College for minimum wage, showing community college students how to perform compressions on plastic mannequins, unknown, unremembered, just another person moving through the world making minimum wage for work he thought was beneath him. But that was the future. The present belonged to something else entirely. 6 months later, Megan O'Brien walked through the front doors of Mercy General in a white coat with her name embroidered above the pocket, Megan O'Brien, RN, MSN, Senior Chief Petty Officer, RET. The title was her armor now, visible to everyone, hidden from no one. New Director of Emergency Medicine. The position had been a nationwide search, with Commander Walsh personally testifying to the board about her competence, her judgment, her ability to make life-or-death decisions without hesitation. Inside the lining of her white coat, just visible when she moved a certain way, was a faded unit patch from San Jin, colors faded by sun and time, stitched there by her own hands one morning 3 months after she'd gotten the job. She didn't keep it there as a wound. She kept it there as a reminder: you survive by moving forward, not by hiding. Her 17-year-old son attended community college nearby. He came to her office twice a week, no longer ashamed of the medals, no longer wondering if his mother was broken. He was learning to understand that survival was a form of strength. Commander Walsh transferred to the Coast Guard station in Wilmington. He stopped by the ER every few weeks, always checking his tattoo like it was a compass, always asking if she needed anything, as if she hadn't already saved his life and his voice and his belief that some people would stay when everyone else walked away. On her first day as director, Megan gathered the entire ER staff in the break room. Nurses, residents, attending physicians, techs, security, housekeeping. Everyone who worked in that space where life and death negotiated their boundaries. She didn't make a speech. She said one thing. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Then she got to work, because that's what warriors do. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories about people who refuse to break, who move forward when everything tells them to stop, who understand that real strength is often found in quiet hands and steady hearts. Like this video, comment below with the moment you decided you would never let someone else's opinion define your worth, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next time a quiet person changes everything.